Hello everyone, today we talk about Caesar's expeditions to Britain for a mini-series I'm making on Romano-Brythonic warfare in the early history of especially the Roman conquest and domination of Britain. I have, like always, that irreducible, in fact, sort of philo-Celtic audience that every once in a while, like there's are not normal followers among the many that are actually very interested, like I am, about the Celts. I have also some reddish beard. So I can be partisan myself from my North Atlantic genetic ancestry. I have Scandinavian as well, but that's actually, like, in fact, what normally these people don't like to hear. That will say, no, because the Romans never actually controlled Britain. Look, there was the North, and then what about the Giles, etc., and I discovered that there is a veritable cult around this, like that you don't really find for the Romans and the Germans in the same way. And again, I will not digress on this too, but I suggest you to watch a certain sort of recent videos of I will not make any names, but that always routinely pop up, even though it's a very well-known question, definitely not a mystery. Why did not the Romans conquer Ireland? Dun, dun, dun. Like as if this was the big deal. Why would have it even been relevant for the Romans to conquer Ireland? That is sort of the most appropriate kind of question. And without mentioning that reducing Roman domination to the extent of the so-called limes, which was not even called like that by the Romans, obviously, but just monumentum, that already by itself illustrates the constant Roman strategic projection, especially in the early days, far beyond that frontier sort of concretely means regarding the Universal Empire, and how, of course, like the entire northwestern Europe was within that, in the ways, in fact, that favored the Romans at the end of the day. Because how did these other peoples live, as a matter of fact? Now, I'm not going to antagonize on these aspects because there is no antagonist here. We'll get also during the series to the northern extremities. I made lots of videos about Gaelic warfare, for that matter. We talked about the Caledonians, the Picts. I also made a video about the Battle of Mons Graupius, right? That these people say, oh no, it never existed because it's just Tacitus that was writing that to serve his father-in-law. It's like, I will try also when we get there to explain why history is history, right? And why we do not live in a broader historiographical scam. People who live in this psychosis and paranoia are just the product of essentially failure of schooling and basically diseased social cultural background. But just realize that in this time where we are reasoning about united Europe, and when people fundamentally are, of course, we're living in troubled times where, again, there is this kind of distortion and complete lack of understanding of the most intimately European meaning of the imperial Catholic tradition. In fact, individuals were so clueless about the world that there is something to fix also probably in the project of the future European school that has to address why, for example, it was, generally speaking, a positive thing for Britain to have been conquered by the Romans. This is something, for example, the French got over for quite a long time. It's part probably of their deep identity and civic national pride. Unfortunately, we live, it seems to me, at least in a Western civilization that is culturally, or at least subculturally fractured into two main areas that do not talk to one another, because fundamentally one does what has to do and the other is so self-referentially, in fact self-obsessed, that has been displaying the greatest problems, civilizationally speaking. And we all want actually that part to not just to survive but to thrive in its deeper European meaning. And with this kind of history, hopefully, we will get there, because Schwerpunkt is not just expanding a bit more into sort of British, but also transatlantic history, right? So there is here a meaning, a signal that I'm launching, right, for those who are, of course, ready to get it. In any case, it's important also to provide good fundamentals for a narrative of this kind, meaning that one has to explain why things happen. One has absolutely to stress that the Roman conquest was as brutal as it was. The Romans were not particularly tender-hearted people to begin with, nor the Celts, you would say. And there was there, in fact, a difference in merit that was translated in the Imperium that was actually worshipped by the both of them, if you, of course, as my most faithful followers know what it means. There's there's always a socioeconomical, structuralistic, deterministic answer to why peoples did what, especially in this more, I hate the term, but this is sort of mainstreamed topics that are part of that kind of self-referentiality. Why did the Romans invade Britain, or why did they stop to somewhere, etc. And one of the most common questions is also, in fact, what did the Roman have to gain from that? One of the most common answers and our object of conversation is how rich was Britain, say the British archipelago, the British Isles. So a brief premise on this, right? In the 5th century BC, Herodotus referred to the British Isles that evidently were connected with the outer world to an important degree as Cassiterides, that is to say, literally in Greek, Tin Islands, all right? So tin is definitely connected with British resources at this point, so much so that Phoenician maritime traders likely sourced this resource, having reached, in fact, the channel. Tin was a relatively scarce and consequently valuable resource, mostly extracted from the southwest of Britain, which was not, at least in later times, as you know, the most developed part, which would always remain historically the southeast. We're talking, however, 700 BC. I also made a video about the Phoenician bireme of 700 BC, circa, so that perfectly fits the picture. Trade connections between Britain and Gaul were very intense. This was the greatest sort of international partnership of the Britons that were, as you know, essentially Celtic peoples, Celticized peoples at large, coming at waves from the continent. In times, by the way, where even the distinction between Celtic and Germanic is quite feeble, especially in this northern European context. In fact, Britain was mostly settled by what would become known as the Belgians, that were essentially a Celto-Germanic people. In fact, the Celtic settlement in the British Isles is quite fascinating because it happened at sort of multiple and basically even uncountable waves, starting from very, very early in time. At a point, it's even difficult to archaeologically document that, but we know it was going on from a long time, so that there were Celts that had settled, say, I don't know, in Ireland or even in sort of closer places to the continent, that would consider, by, say, the time of Caesar, for example, like continental Celts as some sort of invaders had been separated from them by an important degree of time and territorialization in those places. In any case, of course, the channel traffics were historically the most important. They were firmly established as a major network by 600 BC. By the way, you know that Britain and Gaul really formed the most hardcore, what we properly call Celtic identity. All right, I will make an entire video about this, because when we talk about the Celts, of course, we're looking conventionally at classical ethnographic convention, That, however, was substantiated by a court that wasn't much to be spotted in, I don't know, Hallstatt or Latin, so mostly like a Central European, today's, Alpine, Northern Alpine watershed, so to say, but that at least took form gradually with the Celtic expansions westwards in Britain and Gaul, right? The reason being likely that these were richer lands, especially Gaul, right? Britain had especially a rich south that essentially fit the broader Celtic, even proto-urban development to a degree, with the Oppida, with, the so-called Celtic road network as well, an important degree of societal development. Naturally, the rest of Britain, also throughout the Roman times, would notoriously be less developed, which does not mean, as some people oddly think, that, the Romans did not control Wales, say, would have become Wales, nor didn't have another reach compared to they were just next door. They told them what to do. They had heavy interference into all the various petty kings of the surrounding regions. It's as if mostly people had a problem to realize that if a place does not show a particular level of romanization, it's not because they were like in Asterix, the brave independent peoples were resisting. They were subject. They were subjugated. It didn't even take practically a force just to keep them at bay. You could find more brigands. Think about the Bagaudai in later Roman times, etc. But those were places that mostly nobody cared about because they were less relevant and that still were controlled by the empire at large. And that did not constitute absolutely the end, the geographical limit of that control. Also, nobody explains how this would have been, threatening or military performance or whatever. Like the fact that it's difficult to put down guerrilla, which is not the case throughout Roman history, through, in places like Galicia or Armorica, or in fact, even this other British provinces, does not mean that, there is a mighty military force behind that. It's mostly the Romans that, in the moment in which they will create their walls, will put an end to raids coming from peoples that literally did not have any other resource and better thing to do but to go grab it from somebody else, because they didn't really have anything that allowed them to further concentrate power there, right? Just also for the record, at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, the Caledonians were literally wiped out as an ethnic reality by the Roman army, right? So much so that what the pics that emerged later literally are the ethnographic, literally nominal proof that these people had been so shattered that they literally were, first of all, for generations, nobody heard of anybody what was happening in those places, because the Romans literally could make a desert and call it peace, according to also their own same terming, which people often read from, like in the mouth of the barbarian in the Roman sources, as saying, oh, look, this is how evil and bad the Romans. But it was written by the Romans as a matter of pride about the fact that they could simply dictate rule to these people that did not understand as essentially a tectonic force the might of the Apollonian Empire. Nevertheless, but again, the Celtic identity is something that does really have a Gallic-Brythonic connection, which is very important here to understand in a video about Caesar's expeditions to Britain, right? That had a very specific political and strategic goal, right? One that had to break, in fact, the support that the Britons kept providing to Gallic resistance during Caesar's campaigns that also took essentially the best of the Celtic world over in 8 years for good, following half of a millennium of an extraordinary success of Romanization. Just for saying, that, the Pannonians or the Cantabrians took much longer to be tamed, not because they were actually the better part or even just the most specifically identifiable fact, parts of the Celtic world as such, right? And it is true that we know relatively few about Celtic. We can't really say, because the Celts were so intertwined with the Romans, historically speaking. They were basically almost the same people, right? The Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one. There are also in Italy certain boundaries at this point. Many of Caesar's legionnaires, so full Roman citizens, were actually of Gallic ancestry themselves, from Cisalpine Gaul, but also parts of central Italy, in a strictly geographical sense as well. The Gaul was so much like an ethnographic archetype and symbol in Rome, in the Roman sagas, in Roman historiography, that it's impossible not to state how much we actually know about the Celtic world, and also thanks mostly to the Romans. That is particularly true also for the Germans. The Greeks mostly also, as we've just exemplified, had documented the Celts in their own independent times. It is true, however, that since the Celts de facto did not write in the way, fully fledged literature is intended, and it's not Caesar's fault if the Celts did not have a literature for that matter, does not allow us to fully understand what, for example, Druidic knowledge. We can sort of understand what it was about in terms of natural philosophy. We know that the Romans were even friends with the Druids, notoriously. Cicero had correspondence, his brother, among also the various Gauls that supported the Romans during Caesar's conquest, like shared old knowledge. Augustus talked to Druids that also, were apparently wanted maybe to carry out a terrorist attack to take him out. In the process, instead, were stunned by his blue eyes and the broader meaning this had in their world from the tenure of the greatest imperium in the history of mankind. So, of course, we know this through Roman sources, but we do not have a comprehensive view or voice from the Celtic world in the way, of course, we can have it from the Romans. But in this sense, far from having there been a damnatio memoriae of this culture of these peoples, like the Romans did not commit a genocide. Like, people do not understand that genocide does not mean killing a lot of people. The Celtic element was a major one in the rest of the history of Latin Germanic Europe. I made lots of videos on this. Just yesterday we were talking about Chrétien de Troyes, and so a Romano-Germanic, a French, let's say, author in that broader European perspective, drawing from the Arthurian, the older Brythonic legions. We can see it from a military point of view. We talk about the Celtic metallurgic legacy in Romano-Germanic's arms and armor. There is so much to discuss, but let's say the drama of, again, the terrible Romans as the antithesis of Celtic tradition is frankly something that we can relegate to, the mentally feeble and people with a very basically non-existent cultural background. Besides, again, the Celtic world was, as we were just discussing, pretty intertwined with the rest of Europe, the Mediterranean. In the late 4th century BC, the Hellenic explorer Pytheas of Massilia, that, as you know, is also in the south of Gaul, and so, well, we can't say too close, because you have to at least not necessarily circumnavigate Gaul. You can also pass across just a few hundred kilometers and embark yourself directly in the Atlantic, but still, the Greeks had come from Greece, so from there, actually, at sea, things were easier. But aside from this, the author studied tin processing in what is now Cornwall, as we were saying before. Again, it's interesting because Cornwall was, just as the name says, like an area that had a lot of agricultural resources, but was not particularly or very strongly developed. And in fact, was like a fringe area where part of Celtic, but also, in fact, the less developed part of Celtic culture kept developing in Britain to eventually, even in Anglo Saxon post-Roman times to pour further into what would become Brittany, in fact, after that Brythonic migration. Pytheas is said to have sailed around the entirety of the British Isles, by the way. So again, everybody knew more or less what that word really was. The Romans would take great pride in conquering Britain because they said that in the legions, in mythology, like Britain is so distant that you will not find a god having set foot there. Like at the center of the world was somewhere, and that instead the Romans managed in what the gods did not, that is to say, to reach and to conquer Britain, which in many ways was considered really the far north, and rightfully so, and like a place that, of course, there were other places around that were considered even more remote. But as far as Roman occupation went, like Britain was basically like one of the worst places you could ever be sent to begin with. And it was not all bad, of course, and otherwise the Romans would have neither conquered, would have neither been able to establish a Romanization, satisfactory agricultural development. And it was not just about tin. The reason what the word there, like one resource can be good, but mostly Britain was an actually important landmass that interfered, as we've seen in Caesar times, with gold to the point of wanting to take it directly over, and also, in fact, not caring too much about the fringe of it, because, in terms of cost-benefit ratio, it's not that important to even occupy to begin with. And it's not like, again, the Romans did not intervene, even in, as we know, in Pict land, in Hibernia, regardless of the levels of documentation, especially for the latter. So it's a non-mystery, it's a non-problem. It's not like the Romans did not take over Hibernia because, oh my God, the people were so resistant. Quite the contrary, right? It's just like even that effort, that scarce effort that would have taken to maintain forces that would have not been repaid by the general resources could be gotten from there. And yes, on top of that, there could be guerrilla, but it's like saying, I don't know, when is that Ireland ever had something like its own control over itself? Like this happened also with the Vikings later, with the English. So it doesn't seem that anything prevented these conquerors to set their foot there and to be parked in the major centers and profit from Irish resources, being unscathed by the fact that the interland remained Gaelic. I mean, who cares about that, seriously? But unfortunately, this is always flipped in terms of, oh my God, these peoples were so independent and so strong and so fierce. Actually not. And to tell the truth, really, of the whole Celtic world, notoriously, Britain had the lowest military quality, which is also pretty self-evident in many ways. The top one was actually pretty close to in among the Belgians themselves, but not evidently the ones that had crossed the Helvetii, right? Britain was also more backward in general. Like chariot warfare was still a thing there. I also made a video about the Iron Age Celtic chariot, explaining a bit what the deal was. Excellent charioteers performing stunts on chariots, being able to carry this wagons in also very sort of broken terrain, but obviously enough because they were very also militarily fragmented and as such also militarily less effective, right? I think knowing even just within the broader, as what we understand as the broader Celtic world, where the higher and the lower military average laid, I think is sort of the ABC of Celtic warfare, but also like a good indicator of whether you understand ancient warfare or not. But we still have to deal with people that, for some reason, do not accept. I've never met, honestly, again, such resistance. It's not like, I don't know, if you let's say other peoples are taking it much better, right? I know that also there are lots of British people who are perfectly fine with that, aside from the fact that they're very much connected at times with their Germanic ancestry rather than anything. But this constant sort of recrimination, I honestly never found. I found arrogance, cockery, so-called like ethno-nationalism, basically any other group you can think. But say in the Western world, seriously, the only time I've seen people getting basically completely alienated from reality. Only in this kind of neo-Celticistic complaint about how much advanced and brave and pure the Celts were, but how also they magically got steamrolled by the Romans and trying to magnify any trace of any possible ambush, including the wall of the Ninth Legion. That was notoriously a 19th century myth fabricated because the Britons at that point, at least from that sort of neo-Celticistic revival, that was not the entirety of the story in Britain, wanted to have, because the Germans had the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So people live still within this myth. Again, it's just a minority. I'm not saying, I as you know, I love British history and culture, and I can't wait also to expand more into its military history. But that's why one has to get things right, and also has to appreciate, after all, even in the limits of a people, like their charm and their like the fascination that they emanate. I mean, the British Isles were truly considered, also by the Gauls, and we're told by Caesar that was definitely an attentive describer, and one of the single most intellectually, historically, and literally gifted men of his times, by the way, that, of course, the center of the Druidic cult was Britain, was essentially the Irish Sea and specific seas that were continuing to emanate this resoundingly mystical and magnetic, heroic, champion-based sort of military culture, proselytizing the resistance against the invader, as many other peoples had done. But definitely with that, maybe this is also a product of the later sort of representation made by British culture that has always been rightfully very attentive to that, but that does seem to have had a sort of more poetic, a more a particularly unique flavor of sort of bravery of independence that, however, did not change the fundamentals of what ultimately went down. Besides, again, at some point, the Britons, the decisive moral majority of the Britons, supported the Roman government for centuries, which otherwise could have not been possible, as also the case of the Caledonians actually shows, right? In any case, what we understand from these earlier sources of centuries before Christ are later integrated into classical maps that in part rely on them, but also knew about Britain, knew about its past, also after the Roman conquest, etc. But today we talk about, of course, the 1st century BC, when the British were developing, importantly enough, exchanging precious metals, iron, grain, wool, cattle, hunting dogs, right, and slaves, of course, with their Celtic and Germanic neighbors across the Channel, which was a pretty trafficked stretch of sea. Consequently, Caesar had an extra reason to focus on Britain during his Gallic campaign. As we explained in other videos, including the recent one in which I explained how the Commentarii del Bello Gallico are a veritable manual in masterpiece in the sense in counterinsurgency warfare, Caesar's expeditions in Britain and Germany, by the way, that, as you know, did not bring to any territorial acquisition, like direct occupation from the Romans, were an extreme success, both politically and strategically, at a broader international level, given that the sole purpose for these operations was to deter any further Celto-Germanic interference in the Gallic theater that was also instrumental for Caesar to, as you know, take over Rome, right, the control of the Roman government. When one understands that all these campaigns were a mean to an end, as Caesar was a politician lent to war, and that fundamentally was nothing personal, right, between Caesar, if not in, I don't know, maybe again the broader idea of the Gallic giant that has to be taken down by the Roman hero. Also in the Celto-Germanic world, as you know, the hero is smaller Think about Cuchulainn, think about the Aesir, like the big monsters, the big dumb giants are the Chthonic, the pre-Indo-European Telluric forces, right? And there is a lot of that, especially in Western Celtic world. In fact, one aspect, we will have to talk more about Celtic religion in general, but what strikes you from our understanding of the Celtic world is that it was particularly loaded with a Chthonic bias compared to, say, the Celts, the Romans. Admittedly, especially the Greeks and the Romans had the single most Apollonian form of Indo-European religion, at least in talking Europe in particular. The Germans already had some sort of more Chthonic, darker bias, but in Gaul and in Britain, we see very powerful, say, Chthonic influences, right? We see a lot of female and probably earth-connected deities in Gaul, rather than sort of broader Apollonian heroes. We see it well also because the local cults kept flourishing under the Romans. We see it in Gaelic mythology. Think about the Morrigan, and how this in fact also warlike female figures actually are. We'll come back on that because one has to understand exactly in terms of broader European cultural references where these peoples laid really, and not to simply switch position depending on what you think looks better or not. These are important because they are really inherent to the intimate identity of a people, right? And part of the reason, in my opinion, is that, which is also the reason why Gaul and Britain were actually more developed than, say, at this point, Germany, right? Central Europe, is that they were much more fertile. They were much more populated when the proto-Celts, so these proto-Germanic, when even in a time in which Indo-European peoples had not been split yet, also the Italics laid more or less on the Danube, would have been called the Italics after they descended in the Roman peninsula. And thus, it's as if, and this is actually shown by the proto-feudal culture that especially the Gauls had in this picture, an important detachment, like say, an important influence of this pre-Indo-European peoples. This is the case also in the Iberian Peninsula because technically the Iberians weren't even Indo-European. The Celts, the part that had invaded the region were, but it's actually a more distant world from the Eurasian steppes where at large, if you, of course, depending on where we want these guys to have arrived, either from properly the Pontic steppe or from the Yamnayas, from sort of the Baltic region, would come from like being more sort of powerful. They came more from the east, and so it's the east actually the place where that archetype mostly laid in. So that the Romans actually thought of themselves as taking over peoples that were not even overwhelmingly impressive. I mean, the Gauls, yes, were also in part allies from a long time. That's also what essentially enabled Caesar to enter Gaul without too many problems, to justify his eventual conquest as a form of protection against the Germans that were actually taking over the system, as the Cimbrian migrations had quite painfully proven that Gaul was open to conquest. These are important steps in the history of mankind. Think about how, Charles VIII invasion of Italy marks the beginning of the Italian wars and of foreign domination of various parts of the peninsula, as not many had thought it would be so easy to actually enter in this very rich but also very politically fragmented reality. And after that, once the dam was broken, there was nothing you could do right to stop the flow, so to say. So this is a pivotal moment, of course, in Western history that we want to discuss, however, today, because we already did it multiple times for the Gallic Wars, that at some point we will have to deal also with in much greater detail, talking about single battles, other military historical units, etc., from a Brythonic perspective. And we can start literally from the invasion, like how this happened, provided that we explained what here Caesar's goal was, right? To dissuade the Britons to continue any other interference in Gaul, and actually at the end of the day establishing them as a Roman client state, which ultimately happened. So Caesar's fleet sailed along the shores between the present-day towns of Walmer and Deal, close to the striking white cliffs of Dover. Just think, even the scenario here, how menacing even this landscape must have looked from the Roman perspective, that was also very much and understandably agitated about the perils of the channel, where Caesar risked to lose everything, right? And this tells you also how important it was to prevent, considering the precarious balance in Gaul, where really a few Romans were controlling at this point millions of Gauls, to prevent, in fact, further British interference, right? To the point of making, depending on this, the entire enterprise. I also made a video about Caesar's Fortuna and the properly ludic gambling aspect of Caesar's decision-making that is as glacially rational as clamorously successful in Roman history, also from a metaphysical and a specifically theological point of view. This was a veritable Clausewitzian theory made theology of fortuna, mater et filia deorum, in the constant making of the empire and in the fixing of the res publica during the period of civil wars. As the Romans scouted for an appropriate spot to unload their deep-drafted vessels, they also made some videos on the Roman Liburni and how they differed also from, for example, the Veneti ships that Caesar had tackled in Bretagne, and deployed their legionaries, so this heavy force that required, in fact, also particular operational and logistical preparation for this. British warriors tracked the Roman progress, ready to challenge the intruders on the beaches, because this is the landings, like crossings, is one of the single most, again, delicate and dangerous operations. They can be carried out because if you hold the bridgehead, you can successfully repel an enemy that at that point, regardless of the potentially the potential superior force, does not, however, have the possibility of fully deploying it to be effective. I also made, as you know, last year for the 80th Overlord anniversary, a series on the D-Day landings, and their consequences in the following days, as in fact it was not to be given for granted that the bridgehead would have held up to a few weeks into the very hard fight. So this situation really shows the also, just as we know how it went, right? With these things like, they never told you how it really was, like it's possible this was all made up because Caesar was writing propaganda. I mean, look, the Romans landed, right? And if the Britons had been worth anything, they would have obviously tried to counter the clash. So there are clashes in history that this is not even maybe the case per se, but that even when you don't have enough historical evidence for, or you can't simply doubt about, somehow are backed by the entire macroscopic political and historical evidence of the story. In this circumstance, the British warriors surely made an intimidating display, right? We're not talking about, again, incapable forces at all, right? Even if the Britons did not have the best forces in the Celtic world, they had conventionally tough troops that, of course, could, defeat the Romans in case. At this point, they stationed on the cliff edges, of course, not just observing, but showing off, especially their bodies decorated with war paint and tattoos, yelling battle cries and wielding weapons. This is part of their mystique, of their so-called heroic warfare, which somehow at this point in Europe really survived only in the British Isles, even though like heroic warfare in absolute terms never quite existed. But again, the Britons had a very strong sense like of the individual valor, as exemplified by their chiefs still fighting on chariots to dismount in the fray and then to be picked up once again, showing this immense bravery. But again, with that, as we'll see now, with less sort of collective capacity. That was also the reason why they invested resources in what they could afford in that way. The symbols properly depicted on these guys' bodies were apotropaic in nature, but even more like displaying properly the devotion of mostly the warbanders were really the spearhead of the Celtic armies as opposed to the local militias. The total, in fact, devotion to the cause, the fact that the warrior was one, literally chained through his torques, not just of his leader, but of the deity that he was the medium of. What we know of heartbreakingly beautiful, wonderful statements, such as what was left on the grave of one of these, directed to his leader. My lord, I died, I hope that it was enough, really. And so it's unfortunately impossible, but still quite meaningfully so, to attempt entering the spirit properly of a Brythonic warrior of the 1st century BC, but it's something objectively beyond our understanding at so many levels that are, in fact, the consequence of the passage from a traditional to a, let's call it modern, more like non-traditional culture nowadays. Now, aware of the need to establish a foothold and erect a camp before darkness fell, Caesar ordered the landing, because another night at sea could have been fatal, and it would have also given time to the Britons, now that the Romans were inside, to amass further forces, or further reducing the Roman chances to successfully disembark their strategic force. So the Romans decided to disembark. The assault immediately on the Britons that were awaiting for them on the shore relied solely on infantry. At least we can actually think that there would have been some horsemen there, but we also know from Caesar that the ships carrying the cavalry horses had been left behind due to adverse weather conditions, so that properly a fully fledged Roman cavalry here couldn't be employed. Conversely, as we'll see now, the Britons did have, aside from the famous chariots, also cavalry on their own that was not particularly good in collective training, but definitely just by the fact that it existed and the Roman one was not deployable was an advantage for the Britons. But the legionaries were really something, especially the most correct description from a strictly military point of view of these professional soldiers was one of assault engineer. This is what properly a Roman legionnaire is, right? So this is the moment which the Roman soldier shines as properly as an assault trooper that can establish a position and holding it under the hardest pressure in the direst of circumstances. Of course, we know that would have been some cover fire sort from the ships with archers, with catapults or something, but mostly this was on the legionnaires' shoulders. So much so that the legionnaires were in trouble. In the first phase, like plunging into waist-high waves, faltered in numbers, daunted by the sizable barbarian force assembled on the shore. Again, we call them barbarians, but these weren't, regardless of their relative, shortcoming compared to these other militaries, incompetent or incapable, say, of forming a sturdy line of successfully alternating attacks using combined arms, etc. So that in this critical moment, from which like literally everything could depend, and this is where the Fortuna Kaiser is also displayed. Remember that Caesar's helmsman was told by his own commander that he was carrying with him Caesar and Caesar's fortune, right? It was a hell of a powerful deity. And as we read, in fact, in the Commentaries of Bello Gallico, the aquilifer, so the eagle ensign bearer of the 10th legion, so the most important principalis in the legion, called out loudly to his fellow soldiers, "Come on, man, jump in. You don't want to lose your eagle to the enemy, do you?" Right? Caesar inserts many of these episodes involving principales, mostly centurions, telling the truth, in order to show also in Rome the importance of this man, like the need for a final reform. In fact, would occur mostly under Caesar, and especially under Augustus, regarding the full standing status and professional condition of the principales, in fact permanent cadres in the Roman army. And so, motivated by the dread of losing their standard and the fear of incurring in Caesar's wrath, that was in this sense like the medium of God, the rest of the 10th legion, Caesar's favored one, by the way, followed by the 7th, hurriedly advanced through the water, clashed with the enemy, secured a beachhead, and set up camp before nightfall. Right? We made videos about the signiferi, plural, explaining what their ethos was. We made videos about the Roman eagle, what this fundamentally was about. Consider that this is the same era of Livy that tells us how, from the Roman sagas, how let's say in the archaic era, centurions arrived to throw the unit's ensigns into the enemy ranks to properly spur the Roman fighters to go get it, because without those ensigns, their life was over. Not quite just in terms of blame, of shame for having lost it in combat, but literally because without those, they couldn't fight it, so they would have been slaughtered. And so in the critical moment, ideally, there's this hyperbole by which, exposing, like this was properly the moment, the kind of action that an aquilifer was called to perform. Like, if there was like a brave soldier in the Roman army, this was the signifer, and everybody had to follow, given that in the eagle was the same Holy Ghost and victory that the Roman army had to follow under Caesar's auspices with God. This is the powerful beginning, and sort of immediately and as adequately toned Roman step into Britain. This is a major, I wouldn't say historiography or pop culture specifically, stressed this because of the aforementioned sort of divide that historically and nationally came to exist between, say, the legacy of Rome that was naturally, but also like more selectively, say, instrumentally felt in France rather than in Britain, right? And that yet it's something amazing if you think about it in the history of mankind, considering the future of Britain, at that time the same one of Rome, and the consequence that this brought, like the inclusion of Britain in the broader Catholic world with the Roman conquest. And you know what I mean by Catholic, of course. Also, just consider that a fleet like that had never been seen in the North Sea, right? So this is one of those, moments as well in which the Britons, like, were mind blown by the sight as well. And this is very powerfully felt, like in other episodes of Roman history. That's also where Caesar had crossed the Rhine with his record time-built bridge on the river. The Germans were utterly shocked and devastated by that, probably more by that than by the the massacre that the Romans carried out of the tribes living on the opposite bank that they thought would be enough of a defense, right? And where in fact the same Romans would establish their own from eventually the Germanic pressure in the later centuries, and that, however, again they controlled at large. This is a bit like Canaanite. It's not like the massacre of Romans was as impacting the Romans as instead the resistance of the Romano-Italic Confederacy impacted Hannibal in that way. And we're talking gigantic steps. So that even if the Romans were not to stay at this time in Britain for too long, Caesar's success in including basically Britain in the Roman sphere of influence was permanent. This was incredibly important. Caesar tells us that the British were supporting antagonistic tribes in Gaul and offered sanctuary to their defeated fighters, which is also perfectly plausible and realistic. These claims are very logical under any political and strategical circumstance. And in fact, it has not to be given for granted. Like any criticism that can be made of this, I don't think has any historical foundation whatsoever. I mean, it's not like Caesar, for example, by having successfully defeated the Gallic Veneti tribe at sea, had simply gained dominance over the Channel. Like you could simply still bring resistance to Gaul through the Channel, even without a broader fleet, right? And so the Romans had very stretched out resources in Gaul. This balance was extremely precarious, and you don't really render justice even to the Celts at this point if you don't realize how obvious this movement would have been and how much the resistance in their insurgency against Rome was potentially endowed with chances of success. Right after all, Caesar would be defeated at Gergovia by Vercingetorix Rex, and also the final showdown at Alesia is a marvel to behold. Like when the Gauls finally, albeit too late, understood the necessity of political union. Caesar's adventure in Britain was definitely aimed also at securing tribute from the British to bolster his prestige, but the political and strategic necessity for his purpose in Gaul was vital, and he would have never risked so much hadn't that been the case. I mean, Caesar was that incredibly coldly and correctly calculating. He would prove this over and over and over again. That's what, again, was his theology of Fortuna was also based on. You can't get any reward without risk, right? And this was a fundamental dogma in the imperial Catholic tradition. Caesar's British campaign also highlighted Rome's increasing focus on extending trade networks and tributary relationships beyond the Mediterranean. You know that Rome acquires a fully continental European imperial scope, properly under Augustus, and mostly on the territorial bases that Caesar had set. Passing to the campaign again, operationally with the beachhead established, Caesar awaited the arrival of his cavalry transports. That was really a broader necessity for successfully operating in a foreign and hostile territory. On the fourth day, these ships finally appeared on the horizon, but were repelled by a sudden fierce storm. Right, and the storm's surge flooded the 80 infantry transports already on the beach, which was already like a big blow, leaving 12 so badly damaged they were unsalvageable. Right, so the Romans had to continuously work in order to fix this, trying to reestablish a more secure connection, probably the possibility of coming back from Britain, because there was just a given time they could remain there. Seizing on the Romans' misfortune, the British rallied and attacked the 7th Legion as its soldiers foraged. Right, so this was an obvious moment in sort of the history of warfare where you need some troops basically turned. Also, because we're talking sizable forces, but remember the Romans were mostly here chronically under strength. They were already veteran and professional troops, but with all these supplies and logistical stretches, they also had to use this precious manpower to collect the means of their sustenance, which also entailed their spreading out in open ground, which the Britons exploited, especially with their chariots, to essentially terrorize them and obliging them to fall back in time for a more sort of conventional confrontation. Now, we talked about Brythonic warfare already in different videos, and I'm glad to expand on this further. British warriors typically engaged in close combat, as you know, with thrusting spears or long slashing swords, used javelins, in fact spears, bows, and slings as ranged weapons of all kind. The Hellenic historian Polybius observed that they fought naked, which was a practice also connected with the aforementioned warband, mystical practices, and beyond. Again, they were organizationally a mixed bunch. Essentially, the chieftains most relied on this professional, semi-professional corps. Mostly the bodyguards were probably the top-notch, heavily armored troops, and then warbanders that in Britain were, again, quite mentally and physically loaded, but also not so affluent, right? And the Brythonic peasant levy would have been fairly, average, well, not sorrow thing in terms of, especially of individual quality and even more overall cohesion. Nevertheless, again, also numbers in these circumstances are important. And so this poverty of the equipment, like, for example, Livy notes that the Celts just wore trousers, etc. That's part of their historical attire and in part also functionality in the absence of further protection. Evidence suggests that as contact with Mediterranean forces increased, Celtic warriors, increasingly adopted armor. As you know, sort of helmets, chainmail hauberks are pretty much connected with Celtic warrior ethos and material culture. They're prominent in the burials of the elite, as we were pointing out before. So while such warlike cultures, of course, were very much, as you would expect, specialized in arms and armor production to an extent, and other important technologies, they didn't really have the material affluence to equip large numbers of troops with this kind of arms and armor, all right? But even more to provide like some more centralized coercive power capable of conferring the collective discipline that, for example, like an army like the Roman one could boast, right? Because we don't even have to think that the Romans, for example, had this huge advantage in material culture strictly meant, right? Aside from technologies that can, especially in an Hellenistic ways, strike our mind, like catapults and other very sophisticated engines of the time. Like the Roman army fundamentals was its moral force and collective training. We're not even sure that all legionnaires were actually armored in the same way, and so that there was even any particular advantage of the Romans in hand-to-hand combat with a Celtic host, other than the strict discipline and the astonishing experience that at this point the soldiers were provided by default, but even more throughout the adventures, the campaigns that had gone through at this point. The Celts, again, were very brave, courageous individually. They were really something, right? But collectively, they lacked that cohesion. They simply didn't have it at political level. As a consequence, the simple capacity to organize themselves among each other was reduced. Their cavalry was simply put together from smaller groups, and so you could be stationed in the larger battles next to people that you didn't even know, that you had never properly trained with in the same way, And while, of course, warfare was not particularly different across Britain or even Europe, depending on what kind of standard you take, at large, the Roman quality spearheaded a greater compactness and push into the enemy lines, right? The Celts had, again, an interesting set of technical skills and sort of characteristic look. They employed, for example, leather-covered wooden hexagonal shields for infantry and round or oval shield for cavalry. Actually, their equipment wasn't particularly different from the Roman one that, as you know, had historically developed basically in parallel to the Celtic one, rather than being, as some people would like to make you believe, a copy of the same. We often talk about the scutum, and also like how the Celto-Italic tradition influenced the Hellenistic one at some point with the Turoi, etc. So there were actually pretty similar people to begin with, mostly institutionally and statally. They radically differed, especially at this point, with Rome being far ahead, really. On the Brythonic approach to warfare, the Hellenic geographer and historian Strabo wrote, quote, "The whole race is war-mad, high-spirited, and quick to battle, and when they are stirred up, they assemble in their bands for battle quite openly and without forethought." So it's not even necessarily a positive thing. It's that they are easily, in fact, handled by those who desire to outwit them, right? For at any time or place, and on whatever pretext you stir them up, you will have them ready to face danger, even if they have nothing on their side but their own strength and courage. And this is kind of obvious because rationalizing it, you have, again, this political fragmentation, which does not mean, again, as we said before, individual paucity or cowardice. On the contrary, these guys are much more habituated than other peoples around to kill people, to cut throats, to be out there stealing cattle, raiding, and committing all the kind of violence that you can imagine. At the same time, this political fragmentation brings also to a lack, as we've seen, of broader order, discipline, logistical organization, supply system, and this is really typical of the Celts that are a bit even overtly characterized, especially compared to the Germans and like in classical sources, because the Germans were more nationally cohesive, right? The various tribes, as we've seen also the Celto-Germanic ones, like the Belgians, the Helvetii, were more politically cohesive by metus hostilitas mostly, and this, regardless, in fact, of their material culture, would have been pretty much the same. The Germans also drew importantly from the Celts and or were basically like similar to them, even though they were actually more primitive and poorer in certain cases. Did not really have much to sustain themselves on the battlefield. And so they, even just in terms of operations, right, if they gathered forces together, it was already per se a political miracle of coordination, of a consensus, and the attack had to happen quickly. They didn't have enough resources to simply stay there. They risked like giving the initiative to the enemy that could also have like against the civilized opponents that they had also just barely met. Like Britons had never fought against a Mediterranean civilization at this point. The Britons had never fought against a Mediterranean civilization at this point. And as a consequence, they had to attack, and they had to attack fast, right? Also, their tactical performance was suffering of the same problem, so much so that the best, easiest, and also more strategically obvious thing to do was to charge, right, en masse, and hoping to break at that first charge. And the stereotype about the Celts is that if they couldn't break the first time, would even try. Like the entire formation would dissolve, the entire battle line. If there were others, the thing would proceed. And we know that things were a bit different. It is true that Celts were gradually towards the later period more spent. Like, say, 3rd century BC Celts were much tougher, much more brutal, much more primitive, but in a sense also much more cohesive, and especially the ones who made it to the Mediterranean through Central Europe were also these war banders in a time in which the war band lifestyle was more extended also to a consistent part of the population. When you look at Gaul or Britain at the time of Caesar, it's slightly different. Like most freemen have practically become some serfs of sort. They're mostly peasants, farmers, and so that there isn't much of a great cohesion. There is an elite that is quite, again, performing, but that doesn't quite have the numbers to face like more consistently organized forces. Especially in Gaul, there are more mercenaries. Britain, as we've seen, is a bit more romantically asleep into its land of mysticism, but at the end of the day, there weren't even any other particular differences among the Celts in the way they actually fought. This is the reason why, though individually valiant, Celtic warriors were often inconsistent in large-scale battles and typically fled if the tide of combat turned against them. They thrived on war, glory, plunder, and distinctively among British tribes, headhunting, which is also interesting. And while it is true that part of their deal was to salvage part of their comrades' body and the center probably of the spirit, etc., was as the head was considered to bring home, to give proper, funerary, to bestow on proper funerary rites. This was true also of the enemy's heads, like exactly for the same reason, say, to prevent the latter from happening and deriving from the power deriving from this head collection. After all, the same Romans were pretty obsessed with decapitations, and this was part of the broader history of, the Indo-European steppes and beyond. After all, we see the Germans doing it, and during the migration era, other peoples doing it too. So it's not really nothing strange about that, right? So turning this into a winery, the Romans were terrible, they were depicting this as our barbarians, it's just your weak contemporary brain that does not understand that this was a major hallmark of their warlike identity. And of course, the fact that you don't understand anything about ancient religion or metaphysics should be decently enough not to open your mouth on such issues. Now, pressed by the Britons, Caesar summoned reinforcements to relieve the ambushed 7th Legion that, as we've seen, was scattered foraging and had to put itself together, halting the Brythonic assaults. And during this clash, we could simply read it as a point from the Commentario del Bello Gallico, but again, this is mostly a series about Brythonic Roman warfare, right? So we're looking at the overall thing. The Romans encountered this outdated battlefield tactic, chariots. It's not the first time that the Romans had to cope with enemy chariots from the Seleucids, for example, to the same goals, even in earlier times. However, the latter had long disappeared from continental warfare. In particular, in fact, the Britons were the last ones using war chariots. They were tendentially smaller, a bit like, the Garamantians in North Africa. These were the last ones that used them. The Hellenistic kingdoms, like the Seleucids, as we were recalling, used the larger versions that were enormous, unwieldy things that just smash into the enemy, say the phalangitic, generally speaking, heavy infantry formations. For the Britons, as we said before, it was mostly about individualistic prestige, like chieftains were wealthy enough to fight in this way, that against the less cohesive Brythonic infantry was objectively effective, and that, local warfare is mostly designed, in fact, on the basis of local practice. It's not like they wouldn't try to smash into the legionary ranks, right? And Caesar was struck by the barbarians' adept use of these vehicles, right? It's not because they are outdated that they are not good. In fact, as he details the Brythonic strategy in his Gallic Wars, quote, they, the Britons, begin by driving all over the field, hurling javelins, softening up the enemy lines before smashing into them. A bit like, the Norman knights would do at Hastings before charging into the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Danish feared shield wall. And the terror inspired by the horses and the noise of the wheels is usually enough to throw the enemy ranks into disorder, speaking of the Britons, of course, themselves. Then they work their way between their own cavalry units, where the warriors jump down and fight on foot. It's also incredibly important because it shows that at large, still the same Britons as most peoples in the sanitary world in antiquity still preferred to show the fact that we're not cowards, that did not fight on wagons or on horses from which they could basically get the hell out of the way quickly, as they would also partly do at some point. But they had to show off, they had to be properly to bail out of these chariots in the midst of the enemy, to basically cut to pieces people around them, and having their retainers going to pick them up once again to jump on the chariot and driving away. Caesar continues, meanwhile, the drivers retire, this is in fact the point, a short distance from the fighting and station the cars in such a way that their masters, if outnumbered, have an easy means of retreat to their own lines. In action, therefore, they combine the mobility of cavalry with the staying power of foot soldiers. Their skill, which is derived from ceaseless training and practice. Like, this is Caesar talking. So remember, like when you say, oh no, the Romans were trying to depict the Britons, the Celts badly, do you realize what he's writing about these guys? Do you realize also how intelligent, how clear, how objective, how accurate this historically is? Do you have the base idea of what this means? This is an incredible compliment and admiration from the Roman side that evidently was just not to be given, if was their malicious intent, may be judged by the fact that they control their horses at full gallop on the steepest incline, check and turn them in a moment, run along the pole, stand on the yoke, and get back again into the chariot as quick as lightning. I described this again in a video about the Iron Age Celtic chariot. This is true not just for the guys that Caesar encountered, but this is also true for the Giles, for the Caledonians. The latter actually had the most developed cavalry in Britain, but they also used chariots. This is very logical in many ways, because first of all, the champions involved here were lords. They had the heaviest equipment. It was very convenient for them to be transported, given the burden of their gear, into the melee just by the chariot, improving how tough they were, right? Just out of selection, right? And that's how all these lords challenged one another in this also individual combat, still within the fray, supported by the retinues. It's also a relatively chaotic way of going, because it's not like here there are pretty outlined battle lines. The emphasis is placed on the individual, right? When Caesar describes, for example, Gallic warfare, it's clear that there is a greater collective organization, some sort of greater command control, etc. Here, the Britons really live in a very primitive and very individualistic world, militarily and socially wise, right? It gives you the idea of how permeable Britain was, also for these very war bands and adventurous leaders, right? All the time they would raid this sort of smoky huts, right, and rocked over some natural promontory, like with all the, escalating like the Oppida walls, and there's also incredible physical stunts. In fact, what is fascinating here is also how individually, like what they could do with these chariots, as we're pointing out up before, calculating the wall physical forces, the barycenter, like standing on the yoke as well. So these are things that require, first of all, like an enormous physicality, considering this is done with armor on as well. And so this is literally insane. It really shows you what did these guys do in order to compensate for their broader lack of collective organization. It's utterly insane and incredible and beautiful. Now, recognizing that a substantial barbarian army was gathering to oppose his incursion and performing this kind of dances, lacking his cavalry, Caesar judged his position too vulnerable to press further inland, right? Without cavalry capable of supporting infantry to further support, like as a mobile reserve, the infantry foraging, it was difficult just to go on, right? To enter a hostile territory where you need to unmask ambushes, you need speed, coordination. Without cavalry, there is just so much you can do. So Caesar instructs his legions to return to the quickly repaired transports, and after having contained the Britons basically along the way, the Romans sailed back to Gaul, especially for the winter that was coming. And this was a bit the moment at which operations stopped, not all of them, especially ambushes in the various scattered, forts that the Romans used to control the populations, but mostly with a success from the side of the occupants, as I explained in the video about the fact that the counterinsurgency capacity that the Romans displayed in Gaul. And so at this point of the year, formulating plans for a return the following year. And so we pass to the second campaign, which is also more interesting, more climatic to an extent. In fact, in 54 BC, and this is also fairly late during the Gallic Wars, if you think about it, and how central this Brythonic theater was for the Romans in Gaul, Caesar returned with 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry thoroughly prepared. This time, transportation went much more smoothly. The crossing of the channel was easier. Caesar brought his forces in roughly 600 custom-built shallow draft ships, gathered also from the whole Gallic, northern Gallic coastline, and so perfectly suited for also unloading troops, horses, and supplies onto gently sloping shores that the Romans had enough time to reconnoiter when they were in Britain during the first expedition. The empty vessels were anchored in deeper waters rather than beached, which was also another preventive measure to avoid the Britons getting strange ideas. And the landing at this point faced no resistance, right? It was so well organized, and the Britons had seen how also difficult it was to simply even defend from the coastline and not from their oppida, recognizing Roman strategic superiority, that didn't make much sense to try to stop the Romans with such enormous display of force. Caesar exploited this strategical and tactical advantage gained by his fleet's abrupt arrival. After disembarking, Caesar ordered the construction of a fortified camp and then led his legions 20 kilometers inland under the cover of the night. Right, and Caesar was notoriously expert in forced marches, even though, say, stretches of this kind were also part of the inherent potential of the Roman army and armies in general. Right, mostly the Romans were better maintaining order in the process, but I wrote pretty extensively about how medieval armies routinely performed things like this, even being capable of making an average of 30 kilometers every day, just like any other army in history for that matter. As the Romans neared a ford across the Great Stour, later the site of Canterbury as a matter of fact, British cavalry and chariots emerged, engaged in brief skirmishes, and then retreated to a hill fort approximately a couple of kilometers west, now identified as Bigbury. This shows you essentially what was going on as the normal Romano-Celtic confrontation style and outcome. Right, at this point, Caesar has a much stronger upper hand. He has his cavalry, he has more forces. So the Celts do not think about overwhelming the Romans, like in the first, after the first perilous crossing that had left them without enough forces and tactical complements. There isn't much that chariots and cavalry can do, but again, harassing a bit the enemy, testing them, recognizing properly the enemy force in the process, and then coming back home, shutting the oppida gaze and awaiting. Consider that these areas, again, were the more developed of the whole Britain. So you would have had the better fortifications. There were nothing really overly impressive. The Britons also used very poor but effective means, like, tree logs, that different sort of even small natural obstacles, anything that could hamper the Romans in some ways. But the Romans, again, given their military engineering background, did not really find too many difficulties. Skilled in siege tactics, Caesar commanded his experienced 7th Legion to build a ramp against the Brythonic oppidum's defenses. Once completed, the legionaries adopted the testudo formation, raising their shields to deflect enemy projectiles, which is something, by the way, that the Celts did in the same identical way. Like, the Romans could perform this, again, in a more orderly fashion, but literally every single army having shields, like when exposed, like in emergential conditions like this, without further cover, they will use the shield in that fashion. People still think that the testudo, the shield walls are, this deeply complicated and so sophisticated tactic is actually used to fight. It's just like you defending yourself with a shield, pairing projectiles with that. But let's forget about this. In any case, the Romans advance on this ramp. They fight, they have a bigger display of this at Avaricum. The Romans fought their way into the fort, expelling the Britons through the surrounding woods. Right, and so in close combat, again, also in small units formation, once the Roman forces were in, there wasn't much that the Britons could do. Caesar opted, by the way, not to give chase, not to essentially fall into a Brythonic trap and or wearing out his troops to attrition for objectives that were not worth it. Following the Roman campaign tradition, Caesar's forces constructed a fortified camp each evening and prepared to advance the next day. Right, this was very important in legionary identity and psychology. Right, in whichever situation, except when you were perhaps in friendly territory, but still at least preparing something less militarized. But in enemy territory, every time you march, was a good practice just to erect this camp. The Romans doing so with striking homogeneity, uniformity, employing properly a specific timing that the Roman army could literally be also by size stretched from an entire day of march column length, so that it was said that when the camp was being built in the destination of arrival, the bottom of the column was basically finishing to dismantle the camp of the night before, right? And this would have not been wrong, by the way. Some legionnaires were stationed around the perimeter, defending their comrades that were building the fortifications, erecting the palisades, digging the ditches. We're told that the Roman camp was always identical to one another. Of course, it would have not literally been the case, but there was a very specific internal pattern. I also made multiple videos properly explaining through the certain schematic descriptions we get from the ancient sources how it would have been, what it would have looked like. Of course, it would have actually adapted to also terrain, to the size of the army, etc. Morning brought alarming news for the Romans. Like, you have to imagine spending the night with all those Britons around, especially with this excitement that they have for night attacks, or this kind of commando-style incursions. It's actually not that good, but at least the forts have that specific purpose of keeping the enemy out. And given that the weather shenanigans of Northern Europe are always there, a sudden violent storm had once again devastated the Roman fleet at anchor, wrecking many ships against the rocky coast, which again means that you have less supplies available, less means properly to come back. This influences what happens in Gaul, because once the Gaul learn of this, because of course there were merchants doing back and forth, like the entire Roman army being in turmoil for this and requiring more resources, they would have prepared forces to resist, to sort of capitalize on the time that was lost by Caesar in the process. By the way, on top of this being perceived as the will of God, right? That was testing everybody, the Romans included. Caesar returned to the shore and directed his men to drag the surviving transports onto the beach within a fortified enclosure for repairs. Right? The cargoes were particularly relevant. 40 ships were lost, many others were damaged. The repairs consumed 10 days, costing Caesar the momentum of his campaign to conquer the island. He had started very well, but he had to stop for several days, which gave time, of course, to the Britons to gather further forces. In fact, word of the invasion had rapidly reached British chieftains. It's not like they hadn't seen Caesar coming that year, but one thing is just seeing it coming and preparing to a certain degree locally, and then having to convince other tribes to actually move once the Romans are actually there, because at that point, even if they are your antagonists, they realize that if you are taken down, they may be taken down next as well. And so, again, there is some very precious time won by the Britons, who set aside their disputes and united to oppose the invaders. Of course, we're talking here just part of Britain. They appointed a supreme commander, Cassivellaunus, famously enough, the king of the Catuvellauni, this formidable Belgic tribe that controlled territories north of the Thames River, and thus basically the most important riverway and probably trade hub in Britain. Remember, these guys were, again, the most advanced, the most Gallic of the Britons, so to say. They would always have historically, like also through Romanization and later on, the greatest contacts with Gaul and the more civilized areas there. Led by their new commander, the British persistently harassed Caesar's army. As it moved westward, the Romans resumed their advance westward, facing more attrition, even though they still had, of course, the strategic upper hand. So the Britons basically giving way as they were trying, again, to save time, to contrast the Romans, but not wanting to engage them, especially in open field, where they understood their inferiority. In what is today Western Kent, Caesar ordered the establishment of a third camp. As in the prior year, during the first expedition, his legionaries were attacked while foraging. It's really typical, as an ambush. But this time, a strong Roman cavalry contingent was there, and it enabled a decisive counteroffensive, as mostly it really happens. Like, this was done throughout all the millennia. During the Middle Ages, I studied so many encounters of this kind, like the infantry forages, and there is a cavalry reserve at useful distance that the messengers can, the runners can really call in time to intervene. And Roman cavalry, also made a video about Roman cavalry, which is oddly underrated, especially compared again to the Celtic one, while it was basically notorious that the Romans had a very strong cavalry on their own, and a very qualitative, in fact, citizen one, plus, of course, their auxiliary one as well. As you know, they used the Germans as the same goals, but still they had their own. And that pursued, in fact, Celtic cavalry and chariots on this occasion for some distance before the latter dispersed across the landscape, which was also yet another indicator of the fact that their consistency was relatively scarce. So otherwise you can't simply even just disperse if you don't have relatively few troops that in fact give way as as the enemy cavalry shows up. Determined to confront Cassivellaunus directly, Caesar marched his army further northwest towards the Thames River, aiming to cross the waterway at a ford near Wandsworth. Upon reaching the southern bank of the Thames, the Romans observed a formidable Celtic army positioned for battle on the opposite side, fortified by rows of sharp stakes protruding from the bank. This is interesting, as we were talking about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, including the famous stakes that weren't even that much. But here, they were part, as you understand, of a more formidable defense, mostly constituted by the river plus the Brythonic host. Deserters from the Brythonic side disclosed that additional stakes had been embedded by the Celts in the riverbed at low tide to counter especially Roman cavalry during the fording. Confident in his troops' ability to overcome these defenses, however, Caesar promptly ordered a crossing with cavalry shielding the infantry. This is very interesting because it also shows how relatively ineffective in field fortifications would have been. In fact, this audacious move stunned the defenders on the northern bank of the river that was suddenly deserted as the Britons scattered away. And this shows you how you can have all even the field fortifications that you want, but if you don't have enough manpower to defend, these tactical tricks are not going to make up for the broader strategical inferiority. In fact, actually, this was a good position, but evidently the Brythonic troops were not cohesive enough to put up a credible defense even there against the Romans. It tells you what I was saying at the beginning, essentially regarding the lower military average of the Britons compared to the rest of the Celts. Again, the Gauls were sort of more courageous for the Romans to defeat it. At some point, they were pretty hardly beaten, and they were not even overwhelmingly impressive, so to say. But at least they would take the field against the Roman legionnaires more frequently, and or they would essentially invent some better solution. Think about the Battle of the Sambis River. That's a pretty interesting episode. Those were Belgians, admittedly, but as you understand here, it's also a matter of say community territory. Like the Belgians were, in a sense, the same hosts that you find in Britain, but they were different enough in this land not to pose too much of a threat either, actually to be much less than the continental Belgians. In fact, acknowledging the impracticality of facing the Roman army in open battle, Cassivellaunus employed a scorched earth tactic, at this point evaluating all livestock and people from the Romans' path to deprive them of supplies and captives. This is, as you know, after the first phase of the Gallic Wars, but also the Gauls had started resorting to, especially under Vercingetorix. So when there was, like in this case, like a sort of more national cohesion against the Romans, and this strategy was sort of much more effective to a degree. It obliged the Romans to lose just out of attrition many of the precious manpower that, as we've seen, was just enough to keep under check this entire European regions. Cassivellaunus dismissed his levies that consumed a lot of resources but were not good for much, and instead maintained a force of 4,000 chariots. So we're talking also elite forces, warbanders, men of real substance, to harass the Romans' flanks in rear, still evidently not being strong enough to face them in open field, though. Cassivellaunus aimed to outlast his adversary simply this way, so without reaching like a climatic clash, without exposing himself. But you can't just do that forever, especially if the enemy is quite proactive and stronger to begin with. In fact, Caesar, adept at divide et impera strategies, allied with Mandubracius of the Trinovantes tribe, another Brythonic rival of Cassivellaunus, in exchange for hostages and grain. Right? So in other words, Caesar managed to intimidate this Brythonic ruler who thought that Cassivellaunus was a bit too strong, also because he was the strongest of all these various leaders. He agrees to provide the Romans with hostages, so to secure his loyalty to them, and providing them with grain to sustain the operations against Cassivellaunus, because at this point, these other tribes realized that Caesar was not to stay anyway. I mean, they realized his own game. Again, it was mostly a matter of displaying Roman force superiority to basically say, don't dare interfere with Gaul again, because it was like mostly satisfactory to do so with the southeast of Britain, because the other tribes would have sent warriors, would have continued Druidic resistance ideology, etc. So there was always, like, it was impossible to simply seal off like the channel and prevent these things from happening, but it was enough to intimidate the major rulers, the ones who could provide the greater forces and the largest infrastructure and communications to properly interfere in Gallic affairs. And this pact with the Trinovantes encouraged other Brythonic tribes to align with Caesar, by the way, showing that, again, the entire point of resisting to the Romans, that were evidently, again, not there to stay and was basically useless. Like, why should Cassivellaunus dictate the other Britons what to do, when after all Caesar wanted simply to take this guy out that everybody else hated, more or less. Additionally, Caesar discovered the location of Cassivellaunus' stronghold, which was yet another heavily fortified oppidum encircled by marshy terrain. Launching assaults from two directions, Caesar managed to capture this fort after a brief siege, taking numerous prisoners and livestock, proving that, again, also the best of Cassivellaunus' defenses were not a problem for the Romans. In all this, meanwhile, Cassivellaunus escaped, which was also not maybe the best motivation for his warriors to keep on fighting. The Britons had devised a diversionary attack on the Roman coastal camp in the south, which failed, bringing to the definitive end of Cassivellaunus' enterprise. The Brythonic leader, in fact, surrendered to Caesar, giving also a pretty potent signal to all the other Brythonic tribes. At that point, you see, there is this swinging political balance where now they say, okay, well, now the Romans have achieved what they want. Let's hope they stop here. And in fact, Caesar did not really want to go too heavily on them. The terms, he said, were relatively mild. Hostages were to be surrendered to the Romans. Cassivellaunus pledged not to infringe on Trinovantes' territory, so maintaining basically a balance among the Britons, which was also important because if they had started to fight against one another again, they would have endangered like the stability of the broader region, the channel traffics, etc. So this would have had some negative repercussions also on the Roman economy in Gaul for continuing the war against Celtic resistance. Most crucially, the Britons were obligated to pay an annual tribute to the Roman Senate, which was also, of course, used by Caesar as a leverage to all those political enemies that in Rome were essentially trying to depict them as just working for his own shady deals and wanted to take over power in the urbs, right? So this was a major political and military success. Caesar really, like, do you understand how clamorously successful and meaningful this is? This is not like a tale to smear the Celts. This is actually, everybody who has studied the commentary knows that the ultimate purpose is actually showing how these specific Celts were to be represented in actually even more flattery terms than the ones they probably were. At least probably they matched the same description as far as they had to be ready for Romanization. And you know that Caesar's policy of citizenship extension for further manpower increase and broader expansion of Romanity, etc., were all part of his policy and the broader imperial Catholic vision that he so well incarnated, right? So these conditions effectively made Lower Britain a tributary state of Rome, which again is a tremendous result to achieve. This also enabled Caesar to return to Gaul with this flank secured, and so to continue his Gallic adventure that, as you know, we described elsewhere, and that we will also resume the tale of in some greater depth at some point. So this is like the first part, Caesar's expeditions to Britain, that are, again, incredibly important in any sort of historical, political, strategic, and cultural way possible. They illustrate Caesar crystal clarity and capacity, vision, and more. We will see, if anything, at greater distance in time what happened in the later generations and how the Romans came eventually to take over Britain and to conquer it, also in a really very simple way, right? The Brythonic opposition to Roman conquest was very small. The fact that guerrilla could continue, it's guerrilla. It's not like a dormant people that can be simply brought to fight again. It's just like a disproportional divide. It can't be simply gapped. I made here so many different videos about Celtic warfare. It's sort of weird how there are not even too many, right? But Celtic warfare, 37 videos, quite interesting. We will make again others soon, and it's always such a huge chapter. It's so important that one can't really stop. This is the 50th video that I make on Celtic history, and again, it's really great that we arrived to this point. I always feel like we made too few about this. In any case, there will be time for further videos hopefully in the future. We must shake the channel a little bit. We must make more views. We must share more. We must participate more. It's difficult to do so, but there are ways, and surely we are on the right track at this point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my